So my name's Shane Windsor, and I'm an Associate Professor in Aerospace Engineering at the University of Bristol. And today I'm going to be telling you about our HFSP project looking at avian sensing of airflow through feather vibrations. So we know birds are amazing flyers in many situations, as this kestrel here is demonstrating. They're wind hovering, they're sitting in rising air, coming up over a cliff and dealing with all the turbulence and changing airflow. Yet if you look at their head, they're very, very well stabilized, looking down at the ground to see the motion of their prey. And this is just one of many examples of amazing flight control that we see in birds. So what do we know about flight control in birds? Well, at large scales, in terms of things like migration, we know a fair bit. We know about their magnetoreception and the cues that they use for long-scale flights. Moving down to kind of smaller temporal scales, we know vision is very important for bird flight, and they use it for obstacle avoidance and kind of short distance navigation. But what about what this kestrel is doing here, where at the really fast temporal and very small spatial scales, how are they controlling their flight, achieving that sort of amazing stability that we're seeing there? And here we know that the inner ear is going to be important, and we also know that somatosensation, or the feeling of the sensation, measurement of force and motion of the limbs, is going to be really important. But we know very, very little detail about how this actually works at these very fast timescales. We do know that birds have lots of flow-sensitive mechanoreceptors in their wings. These are called Herp's corpuscles, and there's hundreds, if not thousands of them in all birds' wings. And we know that from some work about 30 years ago, when you have an anesthetized chicken and you get a vacuum cleaner and blow air over its wings, these receptors light up and you get something. And that's kind of our some knowledge of how we know about this flow sensing in birds. We don't really know exactly what information it gives them, and we don't know anything about how they use it for flight control. What I'm showing on the right here is just to remind me to kind of illustrate how much of a bird's wing is actually made up of feathers. You don't really realize it when you see these wings, that actually there's only a very small proportion which is flesh and bone. The vast majority of the wing surface is made up of these feather elements. And as such, they're a very important part, or we think they're a very important part of the flow sensing kind of mechanism, because they're part of the transduction pathway. So our HFSP project is basically trying to answer the question, how does airflow sensing work in birds? And with my collaborators, we're using zebrafinch as kind of a model system where we can look at different layers of information processing in flow sensing. So at the University of Bristol, with my postdoc Jasmine Wong, we're looking at the mechanical response of the feathers to airflow and characterizing their structural properties. Then with David Perkel's lab, David's here in the audience, at the University of Washington, looking at the information that's actually encoded in the peripheral nervous system, looking at the response to the mechanosensors and doing peripheral nerve recordings. And then at the next layer, we're working with Sarah Woolley from McGill University, who's looking at the representation of this flow information in the central nervous system. So this is the structure for the project, and it's the structure I'm going to use to structure my talk today. So first off, at the University of Bristol, we're interested in characterizing the mechanical response to the feathers. So when airflow goes over the feathers, that we know they vibrate, but we don't quite know exactly what this kind of selection is of that vibration. So we're using a technique from vibration engineering called frequency response, where you excite the structure with, in this case, acoustic stimuli across a range of frequencies and look at what frequencies are conducted by the feather. So we use a laser vibrometer which measures the vibration of the feathers as we excite it acoustically. And when we measure the tip of the feather, we see it's got a characteristic response at about 90 hertz in this case for this wing. And then you've got more information going up to about 500 hertz. As we move our sampling point further and further down the feather towards its base, where the mechanoreceptors are, we see a tightening of the bandwidth and a particular response still at 90 hertz, and then a second harmonic further up in the frequency spectrum. So although the feathers are getting exposed to all frequencies here, we're seeing that they selectively conduct only certain frequencies. So we're seeing a mechanical filter right at the beginning of the information kind of processing pathway. But acoustic stimuli are not kind of what feathers are exposed to. It's a really nice way of having controlled stimuli, so you know exactly what the frequencies available are. But in real life, they're being stimulated by airflow over the wings. So we spent, well, when I say we, this was Jasmine Wong, my postdoc, spent many, many weeks in the wind tunnel characterizing the vibration of the feathers under many, many different flow conditions. So to summarize a very large data set, what we found is very characteristic changes in the vibrational properties of the feathers depending on aerodynamically relevant situations. So the angle of attack, which is kind of the orientation of the wing relative to the airflow, as that changes, you see a spreading of the bandwidth of the response. As we increase the airspeed in the wind tunnel, we see the peak frequency of that response and all of the feathers shifts. And then if we start changing the posture of the wings, the wing morphs, it's extended, retracted, we see a mixture of kind of multi-dimensional effects. So all of this means that there's an enormous amount of information potentially available to the birds in relation to the airflow that's going over their wings. And we're currently looking at using information theory and machine learning techniques to actually extract the correspondence between all of that sensory information which is potentially available and how that relates to the airflow around the wing. So moving further down the information processing or the signal processing to what's being done at the University of Washington. So David's lab is looking at where the mechanosensors are in the wing and what their properties might be, and how this is mapped into the peripheral nervous system. So they're using, in the first instance, histology to map out the locations of the mechanoreceptors in the wing, and using osmium textride histology to stain the myelin in the nerve axons. So then we can get a count of how many sensory and motor axons are in different parts of the wing. And this gives us a bound of kind of the information that's available in terms of the number of different channels. So we see hundreds, potentially hundreds of sensory channels and also a large number of motor channels, which suggests that the birds have lots of information about the airflow over their wings, and then they have the ability potentially to tailor the orientation and tension in the wing in response to that airflow. And to quantify this more precisely, David's group is looking at currently doing electrophysiological measurements where they are recording from the peripheral nervous system with extracellular electrodes and measuring the response in the peripheral system to controlled motions of the feathers. And then moving further up to what they're working on in Sarah Woolley's lab at McGill University. So the combination of this kind of different sensory information is flight. So at the moment, they've done a lot of work at McGill characterizing a baseline for flight behavior in these birds. So this is a really nice flight chamber that they've got. It's 2 meters long, and the birds are flying backwards and forwards in front of high-speed cameras. And if you look at the video on the right, you'll notice there's a little trick happening. So these birds are highly motivated by social cues, and so when the bird does the behavior we want of flying to the other end of the cage, it can see its friend and it will fly back, gets a reward. After a little while, we turn the smart glass back on, and it'll be motivated to go backwards and forwards. So the birds will do this for hours and hours, and we've built up a very large data set of what the flight behaviors are. And the way this has been analysed by Clementine Bodine, the postdoc doing the work at McGill, is using the high-speed video and using deep lab cut to do automated image tracking of the beak of the bird, the tail, and the wingtips. So you can see these characteristic flat bound behaviours where the bird is going into a ballistic phase in the middle of the flight and then initiating a landing at the end. And if we look at an individual and its flight trajectories over time, we see characteristic changes. The flights become more and more stereotyped. So the first flights, when the bird was in the chamber, were the kind of golden color, and then the more and more flights are getting darker and darker, and you can see that the trajectory starts quite high and then gets flatter and flatter over time. If we look at the flight speed of those flights, we can see that the birds are also flying faster in those shallower trajectories. So if I just jump between, you can see the darker ones, which are the later flights, are also the faster flights as well. So the birds are learning and changing their trajectories with experience. And it looks like they potentially are optimizing them as well. And we're trying to work out exactly what they're optimizing for. So we're using mathematical modeling to generate a series of different flight trajectories which are optimal for different things, such as the one I've just superimposed here is an energy optimized trajectory. And you can see some of the characteristics of the flight seem to follow that, but there's other aspects which don't. So we're generating a whole lot of optimal trajectories to different conditions and then comparing them to the actual bird's behavior to try and work out what it is they're optimizing for over time. And the next step is to take the awake behaving bird and actually look at what information is present in the central nervous system. So Clementine is currently developing a little head stage for the birds that will be recording from the part of the brain that we know this information, that their initial experiments have found this information is encoded. So we'll actually be able to see how this region of the brain lights up as the birds are doing these flights, and looking at how that relates to the airflow over the wings in different stages of the flight. And beyond the kind of fundamental science, there's actually a lot of other things that this information and understanding of flow sensing is really potentially very useful for. So we've got other projects, or I've got another project with the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia, and we're looking at how kestrels fly in wind tunnels and deal with turbulence. And these are birds that we can't directly measure the sensory information from their central nervous system, but we can look at how the feathers are vibrating and use what we know from other species to try and infer what information they're using to achieve these amazing kind of wind hovering flight performances. In addition, being an aerospace engineer, I love building things, and I work on, and other part of my lab works on uncrewed air vehicles or drones. And so before I figured out any useful way of looking at this in real birds, we built wings with lots of sensors in them to try and understand what sort of sensor information is even available on a rigid wing. And that's what we see here. So we've got a wing that's in the wind tunnel and oscillating very quickly, and the plot, which is in blue on the right, is the just pressure sensors on that wing. And you can see actually that there's a lot of things happening on the wing. Different parts are getting high pressure on them and they're stalling, and you get a wave and then some separation and reattachment. So there's a lot of information present potentially in these kind of flow sensing systems. And this could be really useful as we start to move towards what's shown on the top right, which is a morphing wing, where suddenly our assumptions of having a rigid, non-flexible body and wing actually break down. And the advantages of morphing wing is potentially it allows much more agile and efficient flight, but it needs a fundamentally different way of doing flight control from our traditional ways of doing flight control for rigid fixed-wing aircraft. So these are all potentially really going to be have the information from actually understanding how the birds use this could be potentially very useful for making efficient, relevant information processing systems for future vehicles. With that, I'd just like to conclude and summarize what I've covered today. So we know that feathers are conducting certain frequencies. We're not sure exactly why those frequencies are the ones of interest, but it's a good sign that there's something to be learnt from the actual structure of the feathers and what it conducts. We know that these vibrations relate to aerodynamically relevant parameters such as angle of attack and airspeed. We know that there's a high density of mechanosensors in the wing, and that the birds are learning optimized trajectories over time. And we're currently in the process of using mathematical models to try and understand their optimization and electrophysiology to identify the processing in the peripheral and central nervous system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we have time for question.
Hello? Yes. Very nice talk. I was wondering if you have any evidence for the mechanoreceptor selectivity to the direction of airflow.
That's a very good question. Not at the moment. We're kind of in the stage of the initial analysis of the peripheral nervous system responses, which is where that information will be present. So with the controlled stimuli, you should be able to see if it's in one direction or another, how the response changes. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to see if there's anything analogous to the bats in there as well.
Okay, another question?
Hi, thanks, very nice talk. I was wondering if you could say something about, or hazard a guess, as to the role of passive mechanical design that allows them to deal with these problems at very short timescales versus active control, because sort of, it seems very brute force engineering to just have thousands of sensors in your wing if you could have a clever passive mechanical design solution to it. Yeah,
that's a great question, and it's something that we've, in my lab, we've looked at separately as well. And if anyone wants to see some amazing videos of owls flying through gusts of wind, come and see me afterwards. But basically what we've found with larger birds, when they fly through a controlled gust, is you see their wings go like this, but their body continues in a nice straight line. And basically we've found that the wing is acting like a suspension system on a car, where the mechanical properties of the musculature and the tension across the shoulder mean that as they get hit by a gust of wind, it's like a precondition, and that you get a mechanical response which actually mitigates the fastest aspects of the disturbance, and then allows time for the central nervous system to then go and modify the shape of the wing to maintain flight control. So we think that the wings are these really interesting structures that are a combination of passive mechanical properties to do potentially the fastest responses, and then sensory information being involved in kind of active tuning and on slower timescales. So yeah, lots of really interesting things to be looked at there.
Okay, then I will ask the question that I've been wondering, which is not directly related, but still. What about bats versus birds, and do you think that their flight is going to be similar or is going to be vastly different?
I'm quite jealous about people who work on bats. So Cindy Moss is here, and her lab has done flow sensing in bats. And one of the great things with bats is the sensory cells, the mechanosensors on the wing, which pick up on airflow information, are on sensory hairs. And then they can use hair removal cream, remove that, and look at how that changes the flight behavior of the bat. I'd love to be able to do the same thing with birds, but if you go and change the properties of feathers, pull them out, make them stiffer or something, if the bird flies differently, it doesn't really tell you much about the sensory aspect of that. It just means its aerodynamic surface is different, so we can't really disentangle it in the same way as bats. But I do believe that there's probably analogous things that we can learn when we compare the systems. And also, I should say, insects also have thousands of these mechanosensors on their wings as well, and they're doing lots of interesting things there too.
Thank you for showing the videos. I mean, they're beautiful. I was wondering about the assumption of optimality. I guess with birds you can't do mutations and check if the things are really necessary for them to fly the way they fly. But I wonder, could you do a control where you take a wing from a bird that's not flying and then look at these properties?
Yes. So the optimality is just hypothesis. So we're trying to work out, they do seem to have these characteristic learning patterns, and they look like they should be more efficient in some way, but we're trying to work out what is optimal for that. And then when you're talking about the wing, you're thinking about whether there's optimization in the kind of structural properties and the filtering, I guess. Yeah, so the wing is kind of a multifunctional thing. It needs to be efficient for flight, it needs to be lightweight, but it's also part of the sensory pathway as well. So there's going to be kind of a lot of trade-offs potentially in how you design an optimal vibration sensor conductor to an aerodynamic surface. And feathers are absolutely amazing. There's so much structure to them. There's a hierarchical structure. in the microstructures, and then you go to kind of the larger scales. So there's a lot of tuning and multifunctionality there. So it's a really open question about optimization.
Okay, we should continue.
If I
Thank
can
you
just
very
do
much.
some spontaneous matchmaking, Shane. I mean, this afternoon you will learn about bats by Cynthia. So bring the bird and the bat community together.
I'd love to. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.